What if everything you've been told about motivation and action is not just wrong, but actually keeping you trapped in cycles of inconsistent performance and self-doubt? In the next few minutes, I'm going to share something that might sound impossible at first, but by the end, you'll understand why your struggles with motivation might actually be your greatest gift for discovering sustainable action. Most people believe that motivation is the fuel that powers action, that you need to feel inspired, energized, or excited before you can take meaningful steps toward your goals. They wait for the right mood, the perfect moment, or that surge of enthusiasm that will carry them through challenging tasks. But what if I told you that this very dependence on motivation is what keeps you stuck in patterns of starting and stopping, initial excitement, followed by inevitable burnout? The people who consistently take effective action regardless of circumstances know something that the rest of us are missing. It's not what you think, and it's definitely not what they teach in productivity courses or motivational seminars. Stay with me, because this understanding will transform not just how you approach action taking, but how you relate to consistency, discipline, and your capacity for sustained progress. There's something profound that happens when we truly understand the relationship between motivation and action, not the surface-level connection most people assume exists, but the deeper truth that changes everything. What I'm about to share might feel uncomfortable at first, then liberating, and finally transformative. Because here's what most people miss. Motivation isn't the prerequisite for action. It's often the byproduct of action. When you understand how to reverse this relationship, taking action becomes as natural as breathing, regardless of how you feel in any given moment. The motivation trap. Have you noticed how waiting for motivation to take action feels like waiting for the perfect weather to start a journey that could change your life? There's something happening beneath the surface that most of us miss because we're focused on generating the right feelings before we're willing to take meaningful steps forward. Picture James, a marketing executive who had spent 18 months waiting for the motivation to start the online course that would qualify him for the promotion he wanted. He'd bought the course materials, created study schedules, and set multiple start dates, but every time the moment came to begin, he didn't feel like it. He told himself he needed to be in the right headspace, have sufficient energy, and feel genuinely excited about learning before he could commit to consistent study. James would experience occasional bursts of enthusiasm, usually triggered by seeing colleagues advance in their careers or reading inspiring success stories, and during these periods, he'd dive into the coursework with intensity. He'd study for hours, make detailed notes, and feel confident about his trajectory. But inevitably, the initial excitement would fade, and he'd find himself back in the same pattern of waiting for motivation to return before continuing his studies. This cycle repeated dozens of times over those 18 months. James would get motivated, take action, lose motivation, stop taking action, then wait for motivation to return. He began to believe that he simply wasn't disciplined enough, didn't want success badly enough, or lacked the personality traits necessary for sustained effort toward long-term goals.
James's story doesn't end with him trapped in motivation dependency. But his breakthrough didn't come from finding better ways to get motivated or discovering more powerful inspiration techniques. It came from understanding that he could take action first and allow motivation to follow, rather than waiting for motivation to give him permission to act. The story. Let me tell you about Maria, a software developer who had been trying to establish a daily exercise routine for over 3 years. Like most people, Maria believed she needed to feel motivated to work out consistently. She would read fitness success stories, watch inspiring workout videos, and set elaborate goals during periods when she felt enthusiastic about health and fitness. During these motivated phases, Maria would join gyms, buy workout equipment, or commit to challenging exercise programs. For a few weeks, she'd maintain perfect consistency, feeling proud of her discipline and optimistic about finally establishing lasting fitness habits. But inevitably, the initial excitement would fade, and she'd find herself skipping workouts, making excuses, and eventually abandoning her fitness efforts entirely. Maria assumed her problem was insufficient motivation or lack of willpower. She tried various motivation techniques, vision boards, workout playlists, fitness apps with gamification, even financial penalties for missed workouts. Each approach would work temporarily, providing short-term excitement that supported consistent action, but none created lasting change in her patterns. The breakthrough came during a particularly unmotivated period when Maria was house-sitting for a friend who lived next to a small neighborhood gym. On the second day of her stay, feeling bored and restless, Maria decided to walk over to the gym, not to work out, but simply to see what it was like. The gym owner gave her a brief tour and mentioned that she could use the basic equipment for free as a guest. Maria found herself stepping onto a treadmill, not because she felt motivated to exercise, but because she was there and it seemed like a reasonable way to spend 20 minutes. She walked at a leisurely pace while watching the news on the gym's television. The experience was pleasant but unremarkable. She didn't feel particularly motivated or accomplished afterward. The next day, feeling equally unmotivated, but remembering that the gym visit had been a pleasant way to break up her afternoon, Maria returned. Again, she walked on the treadmill for 20 minutes while watching television. No grand fitness goals, no intense motivation, just a simple activity that filled time and provided mild enjoyment. This pattern continued for the week of house-sitting. Maria would visit the gym when she felt like taking a break from work, not because she was motivated to exercise, but because it had become a simple, available option. By the end of the week, she noticed something interesting. She was looking forward to these gym visits, not as intense workout sessions, but as pleasant breaks that made her feel slightly more energetic and satisfied with her day. When Maria returned to her own home, she decided to experiment with this non-motivated approach to exercise. Instead of waiting to feel enthusiastic about fitness, she committed to simply showing up at her local gym for 15 minutes every day, regardless of what she did once there. Some days she walked slowly on the treadmill while reading, other days she did gentle stretching. Occasionally, she felt energetic enough for more intensive exercise, but that wasn't the goal or expectation.
6 months later, Maria had exercised consistently for longer than any previous attempt. But more importantly, she had discovered something profound about the relationship between action and motivation. The daily gym visits had gradually generated genuine enthusiasm for fitness, but this motivation had emerged from consistent action rather than being required for it. Maria realized that her previous approach had been backwards. She'd been waiting for motivation to sustain action, but motivation was actually the result of action sustained over time. The satisfaction of keeping commitments to herself, the gradual improvements in energy and strength, and the identity shift that came from being someone who showed up consistently had naturally generated more motivation than any external technique had ever provided. This insight transformed Maria's approach to other areas where she'd struggled with consistency. Instead of waiting to feel motivated to organize her apartment, learn new programming skills, or maintain relationships, she began taking small, sustainable actions based on her commitments rather than her feelings. In each case, motivation emerged from the process rather than being required for it. The profound lesson from Maria's transformation is that motivation follows action more reliably than action follows motivation. When you commit to showing up regardless of how you feel, you often discover that positive feelings about the activity develop naturally through the process of consistent engagement. Maria learned that sustainable action is less about feeling motivated and more about making decisions that honor your commitments to yourself and your goals. When action becomes identity-based rather than feeling-based, consistency becomes possible regardless of emotional fluctuations or external circumstances. This story illustrates why the most consistent action takers don't depend on motivation. They've discovered that taking action creates motivation more effectively than waiting for motivation creates action. Their approach feels more sustainable and generates more satisfaction because it's based on reliable systems rather than unpredictable emotions. The truth. Here's what transforms everything about taking action without motivation. Motivation isn't the engine that drives action, it's often the exhaust that results from action. When you reverse your understanding of this relationship and learn to take action based on commitment, identity, and systems rather than feelings, you discover that consistent action naturally generates the motivation that you were waiting for before taking action.
Most people exhaust themselves trying to generate and maintain motivation as a prerequisite for action, which puts them at the mercy of their fluctuating emotional states and external circumstances. But this approach creates dependency on feelings that are inherently inconsistent, leading to patterns of sporadic effort rather than sustained progress. While conventional wisdom suggests that you need to want to do something before you can do it effectively, master practitioners understand that want often follows action rather than preceding it. They've learned to create systems and identities that support action regardless of momentary motivation, which paradoxically generates more consistent positive feelings about their activities. Think of how a processional musician practices. They don't wait to feel inspired before touching their instrument each day. They practice because practicing is what musicians do, regardless of whether they feel particularly creative or enthusiastic about that day's session. Their action isn't dependent on motivation. Their action creates momentum, skill development, and often inspiration through the process of engaging with their craft.
Your approach to any meaningful activity can work the same way. When you learn to act based on decisions you've made and identities you've chosen rather than feelings you're experiencing, you discover that motivation often emerges from the process of taking action rather than being required before action becomes possible. This understanding completely transforms your relationship to consistency and discipline. Instead of seeing these as character traits that require intense willpower and constant motivation, you begin to recognize them as skills that can be developed through proper systems and approaches that work with human psychology rather than against it. Here's what most people miss. The satisfaction of kept commitments, the pride of progress, and the momentum of forward movement naturally generate positive feelings about activities, even when those activities initially felt neutral or challenging. Your brain literally rewards you for following through on commitments, which creates motivation as a byproduct of action rather than as a prerequisite. The secret lies in understanding that humans are designed to feel good about taking action that serves their values and goals. But this positive feeling system works most effectively when it's responding to actual behavior rather than trying to generate behavior. When you honor your commitments regardless of momentary feelings, your psychological reward systems naturally reinforce this pattern. This is why forced motivation techniques often fail, while action-first approaches tend to succeed. Trying to generate motivation artificially through external techniques fights against your natural psychological patterns, while taking committed action works with these patterns by allowing your brain's natural reward systems to support continued action. The practical implication is that sustainable action develops through building systems and making identity-based decisions rather than through motivation management techniques. You learn to act consistently by creating conditions that make action easy and automatic, not by trying to maintain constant enthusiasm about your activities. When you understand this principle, taking action stops feeling like something that requires special emotional preparation and starts feeling like a natural expression of your commitments and identity. You're not fighting against your lack of motivation, you're working with your natural psychological patterns to create sustainable progress. The most successful action takers aren't people who feel more motivated, they're people who have learned to act effectively regardless of their motivation levels. Their consistency comes from systems and identity rather than from emotional states, which makes their progress both more sustainable and more satisfying over time. Natural action. Now that you understand the principle, let's explore how to create sustainable action patterns that work independently of motivation while often generating motivation as a natural byproduct. Identity foundation. The foundation of motivation-independent action is establishing identity-based decisions rather than outcome-based or feeling-based decisions. When your actions flow from who you are rather than from what you want to achieve or how you feel in the moment, consistency becomes natural rather than requiring constant effort. Most people make action decisions based on their goals or their current emotional state, both of which are external to their core sense of self. This creates inconsistency because goals can feel distant or overwhelming while emotions fluctuate constantly.
But when you make decisions based on identity, the kind of person you are and want to continue being, action becomes an expression of your core self, rather than a strategy for achieving external outcomes. Begin developing identity-based action by clarifying who you are at your core when you're living according to your values and commitments. This isn't about creating an artificial persona, but about recognizing the authentic version of yourself that emerges when you're honoring your deepest priorities. What kind of person do you naturally become when you're living with integrity and commitment? Practice making action decisions from this identity perspective rather than from outcome-focused or feeling-based perspectives. Instead of asking, "Do I feel like exercising?" or "Will this workout get me to my fitness goal?" ask, "What would someone who values their health and keeps commitments to themselves do in this situation?" This shifts your decision-making from external variables to internal consistency. Notice how identity-based decisions feel different from motivation-dependent decisions. Identity-based action often feels calmer and more sustainable because it's aligned with your core sense of self rather than dependent on changing circumstances or emotional states. There's less internal negotiation because the decision flows from who you are rather than from what you want or how you feel. Develop specific identity statements that support the actions you want to take consistently. Instead of, "I want to be fit," try, "I am someone who takes care of their body." Instead of, "I should write more," try, "I am someone who expresses themselves through writing." These identity statements provide stable foundations for action that don't depend on motivation or external validation. As you practice identity-based action, you'll notice that consistency begins to feel more natural and less effortful. This isn't because the actions themselves become easier, but because acting consistently with your identity feels aligned and authentic rather than forced or artificial. System design. The second foundation involves creating environmental and structural systems that make desired actions easier to take than not taking them, regardless of your motivation level. Most people rely on willpower and motivation to overcome obstacles and friction, but this approach fails when motivation is low. Effective systems remove obstacles and create conditions where action becomes the path of least resistance. Environmental design is crucial for motivation-independent action. Your physical environment should support the actions you want to take consistently while creating friction for actions you want to avoid. This might mean setting out workout clothes the night before, keeping healthy food easily accessible, or creating a dedicated workspace that makes important work feel natural and convenient. Time-based systems are equally important. Instead of trying to find time for important activities when you feel motivated, establish specific times when these activities automatically happen regardless of your emotional state. This removes the daily decision-making that often becomes a barrier when motivation is absent. Create preparation systems that make action initiation as simple as possible. Complex startup sequences create opportunities for motivation-dependent decision-making, while simple, automatic beginnings allow action to start before resistance can build. The easier it is to begin, the less motivation required to overcome initial inertia. Develop minimum viable action thresholds that maintain consistency even during low motivation periods. Instead of planning elaborate workout sessions that require high energy and enthusiasm, establish minimum commitments like show up at the gym for 10 minutes that can be honored regardless of how you feel. These minimum thresholds preserve the pattern of action even when circumstances aren't optimal.
Build accountability systems that create external structure for action taking without depending on internal motivation. This might involve working with partners, joining groups, or creating public commitments that make action socially expected rather than personally optional. External accountability compensates for fluctuating internal motivation. The goal is creating conditions where taking action feels easier and more natural than not taking action, regardless of your emotional state. When your systems are properly designed, consistency emerges from your environment and structure rather than from your willpower and motivation. Progressive development. The third foundation recognizes that motivation-independent action develops gradually through building tolerance for action without immediate emotional rewards.
Most people expect to feel good about their actions immediately, but sustainable action often requires taking steps before you feel like taking them and finding satisfaction in the process of honoring commitments rather than an immediate gratification. Start with actions that are small enough to complete regardless of motivation level, but meaningful enough to create a sense of accomplishment and progress. These actions should stretch your comfort zone slightly without being so challenging that they require intense motivation to complete. The goal is building confidence in your ability to act independently of feelings. Practice taking action during periods when you explicitly don't feel motivated, not to prove anything dramatic, but to develop familiarity with action that isn't driven by enthusiasm or excitement. This builds psychological muscle for acting based on commitment rather than emotion, which becomes invaluable during inevitable periods of low motivation. Notice and appreciate the satisfaction that comes from honoring commitments to yourself even when the action itself doesn't feel immediately rewarding. This internal reward system, the pride of keeping your word to yourself, often provides more sustainable motivation than external results or emotional highs. Gradually increase the complexity and challenge of actions you can take without depending on motivation. As your capacity for motivation-independent action develops, you can apply this skill to increasingly important areas of your life, from simple daily habits to major life goals and challenges. Track your consistency rather than your results to reinforce the value of showing up regardless of how you feel. Consistency metrics help you recognize progress in building this crucial capability even when other outcomes aren't immediately visible or satisfying. The development process helps you discover that you can take meaningful action regardless of your emotional state, which dramatically increases your capacity for sustained progress toward any goal that matters to you. Momentum creation. The fourth foundation involves understanding how consistent action creates psychological and practical momentum that often generates motivation as a natural byproduct. When you learn to create momentum through committed action, you discover that motivation becomes more consistent and reliable, not as a prerequisite for action, but as a result of action. Consistent action, even when initially unmotivated, creates several types of momentum that support continued action. Progress momentum comes from seeing tangible results from your efforts, which generates satisfaction and confidence. Identity momentum develops as you prove to yourself that you're someone who follows through on commitments. Skill momentum emerges as your capabilities improve through practice, making action feel more natural and effective. Practice taking action during periods when you explicitly don't feel motivated, not to prove anything dramatic, but to develop familiarity with action that isn't driven by enthusiasm or excitement. This builds psychological muscle for acting based on commitment rather than emotion, which becomes invaluable during inevitable periods of low motivation. Notice and appreciate the satisfaction that comes from honoring commitments to yourself, even when the action itself doesn't feel immediately rewarding. This internal reward system, the pride of keeping your word to yourself, often provides more sustainable motivation than external results or emotional highs. Gradually increase the complexity and challenge of actions you can take without depending on motivation. As your capacity for motivation-independent action develops, you can apply this skill to increasingly important areas of your life, from simple daily habits to major life goals and challenges. Track your consistency rather than your results to reinforce the value of showing up regardless of how you feel. Consistency metrics help you recognize progress in building this crucial capability even when other outcomes aren't immediately visible or satisfying. The development process helps you discover that you can take meaningful action regardless of your emotional state, which dramatically increases your capacity for sustained progress toward any goal that matters to you.
Pay attention to how motivation naturally emerges from the process of taking consistent action rather than trying to generate motivation before taking action. Notice the satisfaction of kept commitments, the pride of progress, and the increased confidence that comes from proving your reliability to yourself. These naturally occurring positive feelings provide sustainable fuel for continued action. Create feedback loops that help you recognize the momentum you're building through consistent action. This might involve tracking progress, celebrating small wins, or reflecting on how your consistent action is changing your sense of identity and capability. Recognition of momentum helps maintain action during periods when immediate results aren't obvious. Use momentum periods to establish systems and habits that will support action during low momentum periods. When motivation is naturally high, focus on creating structure and removing obstacles rather than just taking intensive action. This strategic use of high motivation periods creates sustainable support for long-term consistency. Learn to recognize the difference between motivation that precedes action and motivation that follows action. The motivation that emerges from consistent action tends to be more stable and sustainable because it's based on actual experience rather than projected hopes or external inspiration. As momentum builds, you'll often find that actions that initially required conscious effort become increasingly automatic and natural. This progression from effortful action to natural action represents mastery of motivation-independent behavior and creates a foundation for sustained achievement in any area of life. Living action. As these foundations become established, something remarkable happens. Taking action stops feeling like something that requires special emotional preparation and starts feeling like a natural expression of who you are and what you're committed to creating in your life. Effortless consistency. True mastery of motivation-independent action is characterized by consistency that feels natural and sustainable, rather than forced or effortful. You're not using willpower to override your lack of motivation, you're operating from systems and identity that make action feel like the obvious choice regardless of your emotional state. This effortless consistency emerges when your action patterns are properly aligned with your identity, supported by effective systems, and reinforced by the natural satisfaction that comes from honoring commitments to yourself. The actions don't necessarily become easier, but taking them becomes automatic because they're integrated into your natural way of being. People often notice that you seem to accomplish things with unusual consistency and reliability, not because you're more motivated, but because your action-taking isn't dependent on fluctuating emotional states. Your consistency looks effortless from the outside because it's based on stable internal foundations rather than variable external factors. This natural consistency typically includes enhanced resilience during challenging periods, as your action-taking capacity isn't disrupted by temporary setbacks, difficult emotions, or changing circumstances. You can maintain forward momentum regardless of external conditions because your action patterns aren't dependent on optimal conditions. The sustainability of effortless consistency comes from the fact that it's based on working with your natural psychology rather than fighting against it. You're not forcing yourself to act against your nature, you're creating conditions where action aligns with your identity and values.
Natural leadership. As your action-taking becomes consistently effective regardless of motivation levels, you often discover that others naturally look to you for guidance and inspiration regarding implementation and follow-through. This leadership emerges organically from your demonstrated reliability rather than from self-promotion or position-seeking. Your ability to maintain consistency and make progress regardless of circumstances becomes valuable to teams and organizations that struggle with execution and follow-through. People seek your involvement in important projects because they recognize that you can be counted on to deliver regardless of changing conditions or shifting enthusiasm levels. The leadership that emerges from authentic action mastery tends to be quiet and practical rather than charismatic or motivational. You help others not by inspiring them to feel differently, but by demonstrating effective approaches and creating systems that support action regardless of individual motivation levels. This natural leadership often extends into mentoring others who struggle with consistency and follow-through. Your understanding of how to act independently of motivation becomes a valuable resource for people who are stuck in cycles of starting and stopping or who feel dependent on external inspiration. The influence you develop feels aligned and energizing rather than burdensome because it emerges from authentic capability and willingness to help others develop sustainable action patterns rather than from need for recognition or control. Continuous progress.
Motivation-independent action naturally supports ongoing progress and achievement because your advancement isn't subject to the natural fluctuations in enthusiasm and external circumstances that derail motivation-dependent approaches. You can maintain forward momentum consistently, which compounds over time into significant achievement. Your progress becomes more predictable and reliable because it's based on consistent action rather than sporadic bursts of motivated effort. This reliability allows you to undertake longer-term projects and more ambitious goals because you can trust your ability to maintain effort over extended periods regardless of how you feel. The continuous progress that emerges from motivation-independent action often feels more satisfying than achievement that comes from periods of intense motivation, because it's based on your authentic capabilities rather than on temporary emotional states. You develop genuine confidence in your ability to accomplish meaningful goals. This reliable progress often opens opportunities and possibilities that weren't available when your action-taking was inconsistent or motivation-dependent. People recognize your reliability and are more willing to include you in important projects or offer challenging opportunities. Your capacity for continuous progress also allows you to pursue goals and projects that others might abandon when initial enthusiasm fades. This persistence advantage can lead to achievements that seemed impossible when you were dependent on motivation for action. Meaningful impact. Perhaps the most fulfilling aspect of mastering motivation-independent action is discovering that your enhanced reliability and consistency naturally enable you to create meaningful impact on projects and causes that matter to you. Your action-taking capabilities become vehicles for contribution rather than just personal achievement. This meaningful impact emerges because you can commit to important causes and follow through consistently regardless of changing circumstances or fluctuating enthusiasm. Your reliability becomes valuable to organizations and movements that need dependable contributors rather than just passionate supporters. The projects and causes you support tend to benefit more from your involvement because your contribution is sustained and reliable rather than sporadic and enthusiasm-dependent. This consistent support often produces better outcomes than more intense but less reliable involvement. Your capacity for motivation-independent action also allows you to persist with important work during difficult periods when others might reduce their involvement due to discouragement or reduced motivation. This persistence often proves crucial for achieving meaningful results in challenging endeavors. The satisfaction that comes from creating reliable impact through consistent action often provides deeper fulfillment than achievements that required constant motivation management or external inspiration to sustain. Legacy building. As action mastery becomes fully integrated, many people discover that their approach to achievement and contribution naturally evolves toward creating lasting value that extends beyond their direct involvement. This isn't about ego or recognition, it's about using your action capabilities to create systems and results that continue generating benefit over time. This legacy building often manifests through developing others' action-taking capabilities, creating processes and systems that outlast your personal involvement, or maintaining consistent contribution to important causes that produce cumulative positive effects over time. The legacy that emerges from authentic action mastery tends to be practical and beneficial rather than self-serving, because it's based on genuine capability and commitment to reliable contribution rather than on desires for recognition or permanence. Creating lasting impact becomes a natural expression of your developed action capabilities rather than a separate goal to pursue. You find yourself naturally thinking about sustainable contribution and long-term value creation because your experience has shown you the power of consistent, reliable action over time. Wisdom integration. The ultimate expression of motivation-independent action is the integration of reliable execution capabilities with deep wisdom about what's worth acting on and how action serves human flourishing rather than just goal achievement. This wisdom prevents the busy productivity that can characterize action without deeper understanding. This integrated wisdom includes understanding the difference between action that enhances your humanity and action that diminishes it, between activity that serves genuine needs and activity that merely satisfies ego desires or social expectations. Your action capabilities become guided by deeper values and understanding of meaningful contribution. The wisdom that emerges from authentic action mastery also includes realistic understanding of the role that achievement and productivity play in a well-lived life. You neither overvalue action as the source of all fulfillment nor undervalue execution as meaningless activity. Instead, you understand action as one important way of expressing your values and contributing to shared well-being. This wisdom integration makes your action taking more sustainable and satisfying because it's connected to deeper understanding of purpose and meaning rather than to superficial ideas about productivity and achievement. Your actions serve authentic development and contribution rather than replacing genuine fulfillment with busy activity. Living excellence. When motivation-independent action becomes fully integrated, you discover that reliable execution becomes a natural way of being rather than something you do during specific projects or in particular areas of life. The capacity to act based on commitment rather than feelings becomes your natural approach to navigating all of life's opportunities and challenges.
This living excellence doesn't mean constant high performance or never experiencing periods of lower energy or enthusiasm. It means bringing your integrated action capabilities to whatever you're dealing with, rather than operating from either forced effort or motivation dependency. Excellence becomes about expressing your authentic commitment rather than meeting external standards. The sustainability of living excellence comes from the fact that it's based on working with your natural psychology rather than fighting against inconsistent emotional states. You're not trying to become someone who always feels motivated. You're developing capabilities that allow you to act effectively regardless of how you feel. This is how taking action without motivation ultimately transforms from a technique to learn into a natural way of operating. You're not fighting against your emotional fluctuations or trying to eliminate the need for positive feelings about your activities. You're creating integration between commitment and action that allows both to support each other in service of continuous, reliable progress. When you understand this principle, taking action becomes as natural as any other form of optimal human functioning. You're not acquiring superhuman willpower. You're learning to use your existing psychological patterns more skillfully. The result is sustained effective action that feels like natural self-expression rather than forced productivity, which makes progress both reliable and deeply satisfying rather than dependent on circumstances or emotional states. This is the true secret of action without motivation. It's not about eliminating the desire for positive feelings, but about creating reliable patterns of behavior that often generate positive feelings as natural byproducts. When you create this integration consistently, action becomes your natural response to commitment and opportunity, rather than something you have to force through willpower or wait for through motivation. And this natural effectiveness becomes the foundation for achievements and contributions that feel authentic, sustainable, and meaningful, rather than forced or artificially driven. The people who accomplish the most meaningful goals aren't those who feel the most motivated. They're those who have learned to act consistently regardless of their motivation levels. They understand that motivation is wonderful when it appears, but unreliable as a foundation for important activities. They've developed the capacity to honor their commitments and pursue their goals through systems, identity, and consistent action rather than through emotional management and inspiration dependency. When you master this approach, you discover that you can accomplish far more than you previously thought possible, not because you've become more motivated, but because you're no longer limited by the natural fluctuations in motivation that characterize human psychology. Your actions become expressions of your deepest commitments rather than reflections of your momentary feelings, which creates a foundation for sustained achievement and meaningful contribution that serves both your development and the well-being of others. When you master this approach, you discover that you can accomplish far more than you previously thought possible, not because you've become more motivated, but because you're no longer limited by the natural fluctuations in motivation that characterize human psychology. Your actions become expressions of your deepest commitments rather than reflections of your momentary feelings, which creates a foundation for sustained achievement and meaningful contribution that serves both your development and the well-being of others.